My mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Amen. Today is our second week of the Advent season, where we explore the four aspects of Christmas. During this season, we prepare ourselves physically, mentally, and spiritually for the arrival of baby Jesus, who brings hope, peace, joy, and love to the world. You'll also notice the four candles of the Advent wreath and the banners up on the wall. Last week was hope, and now we look at peace. Christmas, in all its busyness, is a time that we long for peace. So how do we get it? How can we have a Christmas with harmony? I actually want to start today's sermon with a surprisingly optimistic reality. Over Thanksgiving, Emily and I were driving to my aunt and uncle's for the big Thanksgiving dinner. We hit terrible traffic, and what was supposed to be only a 1.5-hour trip actually ended up taking us over 3 hours. It also turns out Davy doesn't like to wait for his turkey, so he cried and screamed just about the entire way there. But on our journey, I heard a radio program that absolutely stunned me. It was an interview with a professor by the name of Steven Pinker. He was interviewed on the show Freakonomics, where they explore the hidden side of things that seem obvious. Professor Pinker has written a book called The Better Angels of Our Natures, and the basic premise of it seemed completely counterintuitive. Pinker says that when we look at the world around us, we are actually living in the most peaceful era of human history ever. Now, some may immediately object. You could point to violence on television or the war in the Congo and say, we are hardly living in an era of peace, but the professor has his proofs. Consider how long it's been since the developed and most powerful nations of the world have gone to war against each other. 200 years ago, these nations would regularly brutalize one another. Then, among less developed nations, if you look at the actual rate of death and warfare, it's significantly lower than it was even 25 years ago. Still, there are a lot of reasons to disagree, but the main one is that it's easy for us to recall violence in our world. We remember the Boston Marathon bombing, a murder on the news, and the invasion of Iraq. But what is much harder for us to do as humans is to keep in perspective how many people have lived long, happy lives. Those people aren't on the news, and it's far less likely to make an impression on us anyways. So Steven Pinker has done the work for us. He looked at the homicide rate in Europe, and it's stunning to see this charted. In the 1400s, the homicide rate was nearly 50%. In the 1500s, it drops to 20%, then 15%. In the 1700s, it's 5%, then 3%, then 2%. Today, the per capita homicide rate is something like 1%. Is there still violence around the world? Yes, absolutely, and it is terrible. But the good news is that something right is happening in our world. It may not feel like it. It may not seem like it when you turn on the news, but something undeniably good is happening when heinous evil in human history is virtually non-existent. 2 examples. Things like human sacrifice, being drawn and quartered, which I wouldn't dare describe to you here this morning. These have basically come to an end in our world. Violent death across the world was once something like 15%. Now, based on the highest rates you can find, is more like 3%. And since World War II is less than 1%. When you look globally, we find our world is so close to peace. Yet, peace is not complete. There is more to be done. And it doesn't take more than a few seconds of self-reflection to realize that within our own lives, we do not have peace. We may not take violent action against the neighbor, but we would not use a word like peace or harmony for some of those relationships either. I've shared once or twice about my neighbor who wants to sue the church because he says we are dumping raw sewage onto our own property. It's preposterous and not true, but his insistence that we are certainly doesn't make me feel warm and fuzzy inside towards him. Some of you will be together with family for Christmas. Is there an honest soul here who will tell us you are dreading that time around Christmas dinner when you're together with family? Even if we do get along well with our family, there's still the matter of finding internal peace and harmony. How do we feel right within ourselves? How do we find true peace? The Apostle Paul in the book of Romans shares some ideas. He gives clear instructions to the Roman people saying you need to welcome each other the same way that Christ welcomes you. Now, welcoming may not be the first thing we think of when it comes to peace, but give me a moment, I'll get us there. Paul is saying that Christ welcomes all of us. Christ has an openness to anyone and everyone. So if Christ welcomes you, shouldn't you do the same for others? Paul is saying that Christ is our example. If Christ welcomes people in, so should you. See, Jesus was responding to the practice of the Jewish people. After Moses was given the 10 Commandments, the Jewish people decided they didn't want to get even close to breaking God's commands. So they created rules around the rules. That's called Mishnah. When Jesus came, he said those rules around the rules were all wrong. They actually alienated people rather than welcomed them in. What people needed to do instead was get back to the basics. Love God, love others, love yourself. The real problem had developed around loving others. They were good at loving those who accepted all the rules and lived by them, but they were very bad at loving others that didn't. Paul reminds us clearly that the good news that Jesus brought is for everyone. It's for the insiders who strictly follow the law, and it's for the outsiders. For people who are not circumcised, which was very important at the time. People who have hard lives and people who sin. It's for the sick and the marginalized. This life in God is available to everyone. They had a problem with loving everyone 2,000 years ago, and we still have a problem with it today. There was an African-American church leader who tells this story. He said, "It was my third year with the ministry. I got a call from a prominent white Christian leader asking me to go to lunch with him. As we're sitting down to eat, all of a sudden this guy starts crying. He explained that God had blessed him. His children were healthy. He was known throughout the country. But he said, I've had a hard time sleeping throughout the night. The man continued, I just came back from an annual conference on the other side of the country. A bunch of us got together to discuss reconciliation and cross-cultural ministry. Usually when black leaders come into the meeting, we make them feel right at home and let them be a part of the decision-making process. But to be honest with you, the decisions are made before your leaders ever get there. I'm used to hearing the jokes before your arrival, but this time, when the jokes were told and people were saying things, it didn't sound right to me. How can I get over this? The leader asked me, sobbing. How can we be friends? I was silent for a moment, then asked, do you like football? He was puzzled, but said yes. I do too, I told him. I used to coach and I love to cook out. How about you come over to my house? I was the only black man in my suburban neighborhood at the time. I said, bring your wife and meet my wife, and we'll just sit and talk and get to know each other. I'll barbecue some steaks, and let's start there. He was taken aback. He said, you want me to come over to your house? Yes, I said. If you want me to sit here and clear your conscience for all the garbage you did, I can't do that. Friendship is not cheap. It takes time and commitment. I gave him my home phone number and told him to give me a call, but I never heard from him again. To be at peace with others takes hard work. Harmony only comes when you put aside the rules and start welcoming people just as they are. Paul reminds us that Jesus broke the rules by opening the way for everyone to experience life through God. He didn't play favorites. He didn't discriminate. He flung the doors wide open and said, everyone, come on in. I heard this crazy story the other day about 3 animals, a lion named Leo, a Bengal tiger named Shere Khan, and a black bear named Baloo, who were owned by a drug dealer who never properly cared for the animals. When they were rescued a few years ago, the animal sanctuary separated the animals, but they started freaking out. So they stopped the process, and it turns out these 3 animals, despite being predators of different species, all got along really well. They decided to keep them together in one enclosure, and today you can still see them in what's called the clubhouse. It's at the Noah's Ark Animal Sanctuary in Georgia. Now, those are some animals that are open to differences. That's the kind of peace we are hoping for this Christmas, where the lion and the lamb can lay down next to each other, or in this case, the lion and the Bengal tiger, where those with differences are in harmony with one another.